If only people believed in science and investing in that stuff. Could be nice. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because I have Alice Hill with me, who's the Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we're going to be talking all about the importance of FEMA and the NOAA and the National Weather Service, especially in light in the crazy catastrophic flooding that happened in Texas. So, Alice, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Okay, before we dive in, it's middle of the day, so neither one of us are having an alcoholic beverage, but what are you drinking?
I am drinking seltzer water, my favorite.
A classic. I'm also drinking seltzer. I have my Spindrift. Okay. Delightful. Anyways, cheers.
Cheers.
Okay, so my question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, I have had a varied career in my life, and that career has allowed me to be in the position to assess evidence and then make decisions based on that evidence. I started off as a federal prosecutor. I prosecuted white-collar crime. I then joined the Los Angeles court system. I was a judge. I was the supervising judge on the Los Angeles Superior Court. So I'm very used to looking at a problem and figuring out what went wrong, what's the issue. I then moved to the government in Washington, D.C. I served in the Obama administration, first at the Department of Homeland Security as senior counselor to Secretary Napolitano. And then I moved to the White House, where I was Special Assistant President Obama, as well as Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council. In that job at DHS, and DHS is this huge, sprawling security agency. TSA is there, FEMA, Coast Guard, Federal Emergency Management Administration. And one of my first jobs was to create an adaptation plan for the department. Now, there are 200,000 employees, huge mission set to keep the United States safe. And I frankly didn't know a lot about climate change, but I was able to assemble a task force and consult with the very strong, really the best climate scientists in the world. And they tutored me and tutored our task force. I think we all had an aha moment, and we understood that climate change would affect deeply the mission sets of the Department of Homeland Security, including its border challenge, because people do cross the border when they're hungry and cannot make a living because there's drought and crops have been destroyed. It affects, of course, their Federal Emergency Management Administration efforts to respond to disasters. And then I moved to the White House, where I was Senior Director for Resilience Policy and looked at deeply, what does it mean to have extreme wildfires in the United States? What should we be doing? What does it mean to have extreme rainfall like what we saw in Texas, the wildfires in the Grand Canyon? Are there steps we can take today to have a better future? And since then, I've been at 2 think tanks. I'm currently at the Council on Foreign Relations and written 2 books on the subject of climate resilience.
Well, very happy to have you. It is certainly, a very important conversation. And I don't know how you're feeling, but with this current administration, feeling a little bit beat down for multiple reasons, but especially when it comes to climate change and climate resilience and making sure that we are keeping everyone as safe as possible. First question is, how are you feeling about the current state of climate resilience and our ability to respond to natural disasters?
Not good.
And this is when it would be good if we're actually drinking beer, because then it's like, okay, that makes it a little easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you care to elaborate?
Yes. The United States, we're a very strong economy. We have wonderful communities. We have great strengths in our nation, but we are not particularly strong at this moment for extreme weather events. That would be the kinds of flooding that we just saw in New Jersey, the flash flooding, or rapidly spreading wildfires like we saw in Los Angeles earlier this year, or really the kind of extreme heat we've been suffering for much of this summer. We are not prepared. We have built many houses, infrastructure, and all of that has been built for the past, for what we used to experience. And now we have a changing climate occurring around us. It's getting hotter. The storms are getting stronger. The speeds are much higher. The fires burn longer. And as a result of those events, what we have doesn't hold up particularly well. We see floods just spilling out all over a town. And that's because the town had built to the prior highest flood, protected itself appropriately. But now this new event is occurring, which are more extreme events driven by greater heat in the atmosphere. And that greater heat is caused primarily by human activity. So this is changing very rapidly, but we have a pre-existing conditions that just haven't been prepared for it yet. So we are ill prepared at this moment for the types of disasters we're already experiencing, much less those that are coming at us very quickly in the future.
Yeah, it's really scary because I think it's one of those, climate disasters are one of those things where it doesn't feel like it's going to affect you until you're in the middle of it and it's affecting you, and my roommate and I always joke, we're like, we would never survive in a climate disaster because we get the notifications, from National Weather Service and you're just like, oh, it can't be that bad, and it's this terrible mindset that I feel like a lot of Americans have, especially if you're not in the immediate, pathway of it. But so a lot of this issues come into play because obviously the Trump admin is loving cutting and slashing and just fruit ninjaing every type of, federal program, right? And so before what happened with Texas and Kerrville, where I think 130 people died, there was a lot of blame game of what was going on. FEMA was late to the party. And, the National Weather Service has been severely understaffed, right? And there's all these questions coming into play. Like, how important is the NOAA, which is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association?
Administration. And it's commonly referred to, at least among feds or federal employees, as NOAA.
NOAA.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of cuts to research and people are like, well, is research actually that important? I'm sure you would argue, yes. Why is it important that we have NOAA? And why is it important that we also have the National Weather Service?
Well, NOAA, and there are different aspects of NOAA, but let's focus on its meteorological role. That is its weather role. And it is globally viewed as one of the premier, if not the premier meteorological service in the world. That means its forecasts are viewed as weather forecasts are viewed as among the very best in the world. It also, to make those weather forecasts, collects data from thousands and thousands and thousands of sites. But what are those sites? They're buoys, they're satellites, they're planes, they are sensors in the ground, they are sensors in the river. NOAA takes all that information, looks at the historical data, which it has been collecting for a very long time now, or the federal government has, and then uses that, sometimes with the assistance of AI, to create forecasts, both long and short-term forecasts. And those forecasts can then be shared with communities, and then communities can share them further to make sure that people know what's coming towards them. With a forecast, you can save substantially or avoid damages by taking early action. It could be closing the shutters on your house if you're in a coastal area, or moving your car to higher ground, or if it's going to be heat, make sure that you find cooling places to shelter in until the heat passes. So forecasts help us all survive better and protect our property. NOAA is really king in the world with that. Japan relies on NOAA's data and information. India relies on NOAA's data and information. So cuts to that weather service are damaging to the United States, could mean our forecasts aren't as accurate. And there were reports that many meteorologists were fired by the Trump administration. Apparently, maybe they realized their mistake because there's also reporting they're trying to hire back those some meteorologists. But of course, the loss, if there's a meteorologist who's been in an area for 25 years, the loss of that institutional knowledge is damaging because all of this is informed by past experience, but also understanding what climate change could do to change a forecast. So that's the Weather Service part. And then NOAA also conducts some of the world's finest climate change research. And why do we need climate change research? To understand why the atmosphere is holding so much water that we're seeing 8 inches of rainfall in a couple of hours. 8 inches of rainfall, as we've talked about, our cities aren't built for that. So you have that much rainfall, we're going to have flooding. And we need to understand what we can expect, how we can build better, how can we improve what we have and make sure for darn sure, whatever we put in place new can at least handle what's predicted in the future. And NOAA will help us with those predictions of what is coming. So it is an essential service for the United States. And to see the proposed cuts are very frightening because all of us depend on weather forecasting. I mean, it's you and me. You're talking about the alerts on your phone. There's a flash flood warning, whatever it is. But it's also businesses. It's insurance companies. It's others who are financially dependent on what happens in the weather to make sure that they're successful in their business. And so many, many people in our economy depend on NOAA's ability to forecast. But if it doesn't have research to support that, then it's going to begin to fly blind in terms of understanding what's already occurring across the globe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, it was interesting. I was driving, there was these massive flash floods through the Northeast, and was driving with a couple friends and got a notification at 9:23 on my phone from the National Weather Service saying, emergency, this is a flash flood area, take precaution, until 9:15. So receive the notification at 9:23 for a notification that lasted until 9:15. So there was a little bit of that delay, right? You know, and
well,
luckily
that's probably not NOAA's fault, by the way.
No,
because the forecast goes to the community leaders, and it's up to them to disseminate it. That's the way the system's supposed to work.
So how does that work? Because I know there's a lot of talks about that, and that there weren't I believe the position that was open in Texas and the National Weather Service was like community liaison, and that person they had taken, the fork in the road, right? And so they weren't there. Learning about this, realize there's a lot more of a human element than I think a lot of us realize to it. So how does that work? How do we ensure that people are able to stay up to date when it relies, on a lot of other people making sure it happens?
Well, we can look at the steps in the chain, and you're absolutely right. We can introduce human error, but we can also just introduce the way humans make decisions, and that can lead us to error. But in the chain, it's going to be typically NOAA creating the forecast. And that forecast may be shared through a variety of channels. It could be on the radio. It could be on TV. It could be on your phone. And then typically the warnings themselves will be issued by whatever government entity has taken on that responsibility. So that could be in the state of Florida, the governor saying, everybody evacuate from this area of Florida because there's a storm. Sometimes you get a conflict, say in adjoining counties, and this one head of a county is responsible and the other head of the county is responsible, but the storm's crossing both counties. You might have a conflict in what the advice is. And FEMA would help try to work through those issues with a county so that they could understand, if you do X, it might have an effect on what happens in the county next door. So perhaps there should be greater coordination. So the warning goes out. And then as you've said, how is it received? There's a lot of social science study about what works with warnings. And do they need to be in bold type? Do they need to be all caps? Do you need to say you will die if you don't do this?
I feel like that would be helpful for me because
well, it's unclear. And what happens is if there are false alarms, people tend to discount the warning. And I'll give you an example. So you'll recall, I think it was in 2011, terrible tornado hit the town of Joplin, Missouri. And the National Institute of Science and Technology did a report afterwards looking at the warning systems there, uncovered a number of problems, but one of them was that the town was testing its warning systems, which was great, but there had been very high number of false alarms. So people, when they heard the siren, thought, oh, that's another test, or this is a false alarm. So I think 92% of the sirens, there was no verified tornado that followed that. So people did what you did. They looked outside and they said, it doesn't look so bad. I don't need to rush to safety. There was also an error on the news showing the path going a little differently than it actually did. So people didn't take to heart what the warning was. And then there was no standardization among counties or localities as to what one siren meant, what another siren meant. So some confusion. And unfortunately, there were many deaths because people did not get to shelter in time. So we need to study the social science of these warnings. Many politicians don't want to order an evacuation because if there is no storm, there are a lot of upset people who fled their town and incurred expense. Maybe something happened to their home back home and they're mad. So the person who has to make these choices, it's very difficult, but it is at the local or state level. It's not a federal call, except for the federal workforce, as to whether to evacuate. I agree with you. We need more research on what would motivate people.
I recognize the fact I don't have great survival skills. That I understand wholly, but I'm not a dumb person. And I generally have a good amount of anxiety that motivates me to try to find safety. And I don't feel like I'm the only one. When you get that notification on your phone, you just fail to grapple with the actual severity of the situation.
Yes.
And I'm sure you've done a lot of research into this. And why do we just have such a hard time understanding that it could be a life or death situation?
It has, the social scientists can tell us why we are so poor at assessing catastrophic risk. And one of the reasons is that humans, as we evolved, became good at or better at assessing risks that we'd already experienced. So if you've been in a big windstorm and almost been knocked over, you look out your window, you see the trees are almost bent over, I shouldn't be walking outside right now. But we are not so good in assessing risks that we have never experienced. Like, let's say there's been heavy rain and your house is at the bottom of a hill and you haven't really experienced that there might be a landslide there. And no one has had that experience in recent history, even though scientists might tell you, there is a chance there could be a landslide because there's been heavy rain saturating the ground and it could just all come down. We don't take that into account. And if you think about climate change, what is being predicted with climate change? That we're going to see bigger, wilder, more damaging weather that no human in recorded history has experienced. I mean, they talk about a Category 6 hurricane now because the wind speeds will be so high. Or some of these storms are, Hurricane Helene is a great example. No one anticipated that a hurricane, the wind speeds of that hurricane would go 100 miles inland flatten whole mountainsides because the trees had adapted to grow so that they could stand up with the stuff coming down, but they weren't ready for the high winds coming up the hill and knocking them over. So, or the flooding that happened in Asheville, which was supposedly a climate resilient town. Just hadn't happened before. And that is very difficult for the human mind to get around.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And hopefully this will be a wake-up call to not just myself, but to everyone that, just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
Right. And you should pay attention. What's the downside to paying attention to those warnings? Not
there
much.
Is none.
I can say, though, I got a phone. I got my message on my phone, flash flood. I'm looking outside. I don't know. And then I'm like, hey, I work on preparedness. I better pay attention. Do what it says. Yeah.
That makes me feel a bit better to know that, even someone who has had so much experience in this also suffers from the same, the same folly as well.
While we're on flash floods, and since there were such dramatic pictures of New Jersey, all of us should know, and I learned this in my preparedness work, this phrase, turn around, don't drown. But if you were trying to evacuate and you see rushing water across a road, do not try to cross it. You're very high risk, even if the water is just 6 inches deep, of the car being swept downstream. So turn around, don't drown. If that's one thing to remember.
Very smart. Thank you. What I found really interesting with a lot of the reports going on in Caryville, what happened in Texas, is that there had been, I think, around 3 or 4 different attempts to install a warning system within the town. And some of that funding had come from the federal government, and it's up to the states to decide what to do with it. And in these 3 or 4 attempts, they'd been denied funding. And obviously, climate change is coming at us, and it's going to just slap us around, right? Like, how can we ensure that our towns receive the local government officials know what needs to be done, right? They know what's going to keep people safe or as safe as possible. How do we ensure that they are given the funds that are needed to install these warning systems and better prepare these towns and build up this infrastructure?
Well, that is, it was unfortunate. The state of Texas had the decision about how to disperse those funds and chose not to prioritize that project for the early warning system. I think the thing that would be helpful is if there were greater understanding of how effective early warning systems can be in terms of saving lives, and that it's probably one of the cheapest things that we can do to adapt to worsening events. Help people get out of harm's way, give them as much time, advance warning as we possibly can, but help get them out of harm's way, and maybe they'll even be able to protect their property. So the Global Commission on Adaptation has called out that it is very cost effective to invest in early warning systems. Similarly, we know that in Bangladesh, which has invested, a not-so-rich country has built a massive early warning system. In 1970, there was a Cyclone Bola, that killed about 500,000 people. And in those days, there wasn't warning. So Bangladesh, it's a new country, but over the years, it has said, we've got to do better. So it has increased year after year almost its investments in evacuation shelters and then in early warning systems. And how do they run their early warning systems? Well, they train tens of thousands of people, including many women, because the women can be trusted messengers on this in their society. And then they give people bullhorns. They have the religious centers broadcast that this is occurring. They have people knocking door to door to warn of a typhoon. So in 2020, Cyclone Amphen hit, and only 30 people died. that is just shows you if you plan a little bit ahead, and then they have the evacuation centers ready. And many of those evacuation centers are schools and other times. So it's not a single use facility, but you can make sure that people will be alive at the end of these events. But if you don't have the system in place, you're having what happened, unfortunately and tragically in Texas, people waking up to water all over the floor, and it may just simply be too late to get to safety. So you need to take the forecast, and then you need to help people understand that they need to leave and where they can go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If only people believed in science and investing in that stuff. Could be nice.
It could be.
Nice.
We do have to rely on the scientists. But remarkably, the scientists have proven accurate, at least in predicting what climate change would look like. What is occurring is consistent with what the predictions have been. I think the surprise has been it's happening more quickly than we thought it would.
Awesome.
Well, I don't know about awesome, but it is.
Wish I had a beer with that.
Yeah.
Wish I had a beer for that. You've worked a lot, right, with knowing FEMA, and the current administration has called out a lot of supposed problems with FEMA, and originally said they want to get rid of it, and now they're realizing that's very unpopular, but they say they want to, break it down and build back up better in order to better serve the interests of the people. What are your thoughts on that claim? How well does FEMA run? What are its faults? What is it do great at? And is there anything you want to counter the administration on?
Well, I don't think there's anyone who really disputes that FEMA could use reform. It's in DHS, and I did work in DHS, but it's one of 7 components of DHS. It has a dual report for its head, a full report to the president, as well as the Secretary of Homeland Security. And then it has a whole number of programs created by Congress, and that's how it works. But Congress has tied FEMA's hands with a number of the programs. Let's take the federal flood insurance program. It's been difficult for FEMA to enact the kind of reforms that would make that program be more sound financially. It's about $20 billion in the hole. FEMA has worked to try to correct that, but it's politically unpopular. So, people with FEMA has a job where it needs to tell people, you're living in a floodplain, you might get flooded. Well, many homeowners really don't want to hear that because it affects their property value. They think that there must be something wrong. It's never flooded here before. So FEMA has a very hard job in terms of just working in the community because it's sometimes delivering unwelcome news. And then it's meeting people at a point of crisis where everyone's in a very difficult position, and I think that they can sometimes be the punching bag. With that said, do they always deliver perfectly? No. And there have been certainly many complaints along the way, and that's where reform could help in making them more customer friendly so that it's not multiple applications and, a complex formula to figure out whether people get aid. Simplifying the ability for FEMA to interact with people would greatly assist. I'll never forget that Thad Allen, who was the Commandant of the Coast Guard during Katrina, he replaced the head of FEMA, Michael Brown, during that event to do the response at Katrina. And there's a story about him that he arrives on scene, just utter devastation. And he jumps up on a picnic table and he's addressing the first responders. And some young first responder asks, sir, how should we treat these victims? And Thad Allen says, treat them like they're your family. And that's what we need to make sure that we're remembering. These are people, all of us, it could be any of us that are victims of these events, and they needed to be, need to be treated with care, compassion, and simplify the procedures so that they can get through this and get on with their lives and be not horribly stalled out or so incredibly damaged by the event. So FEMA, a lot of reform of its programs, how it interfaces with the public. But part of that's through statutes and part of that's just reforming its own internal procedures.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I would argue everyone in every political aisle is very much game for simplifying procedures, and making it work better. It's just a matter of how you do it. That seems to be a little bit,
What doesn't make sense of what the Trump administration is proposing is they want to say, well, the state and local governments should be primarily responsible for disaster response. And they are. FEMA is the cavalry. It's supposed to come in at the end when the state and local tribal territorial governments are overwhelmed. That's when you call for FEMA. But emergency management across the nation is heavily dependent on FEMA for training, for communication systems that can go across jurisdictional boundaries, so for best practices, for equipment like a volunteer fire department's truck. A grant could pay for that. So the Trump administration is saying we want to shift more of that responsibility to the state and local and tribal governments. That's okay. That's a philosophical judgment. But what's not okay is to leave those governments with nothing right now, no federal support, and then they don't have the money from their legislatures yet. So then they have a big gap. Ill-prepared, insufficient emergency management teams and responses in many states. Texas is one of the most prepared, and that event didn't go well. California is well prepared. The wildfires didn't go well, but some of these smaller, less well-funded states are really dependent on FEMA for their emergency management training, for supplemental personnel, for resources to be able to operate. So you pull the plug on that, and there's no FEMA, no cavalry arriving, and there's nobody there. That's when you get a disaster that gets greatly amplified when really, if there were a good response, fewer people would die, less damage. But so that's the challenge here, is they're setting it up as just a sudden withdrawal. And you'd have to put in place the mechanisms to help the locals be better at emergency management so they wouldn't need so much aid from FEMA.
That's a really good insight. Thank you for providing clarity on that. I feel like this has been very helpful in understanding how these systems work, what can make them better, and what as individuals we need to do. But, you have a lot of experience in preparation. What's one thing that a person can do now to better prepare themselves for the ultimate climate disasters that will be coming our way?
Well, I think all of us should look at what our communities are doing to prepare. What are the risks to our communities? And are those risks ones that we feel comfortable living under? Because I do think you will see more people on the move to the extent that governments aren't preparing and they feel very vulnerable. So I think being informed about what are the risks you face and what you can do to reduce those risks. There are a lot of things we can personally do to reduce risk. Heat, we've heard many advisements this summer, but we've talked about turn around, don't drown. If you've got a drought, you've got to think about water conservation, steps that all of us can have at the ready, and then always to have some kind of emergency supplies, no matter where you are, a flashlight, some water, and some good shoes to be able to walk to safety if you need to.
Good shoes is an important one. That's a
for
good
the
reminder.
women. It's really important. You don't want to be in stilettos when there's an earthquake.
Yeah, my dad's a moderately like emergency prepared person, like more than I think the most social people are, but like still within not like a survivalist. And he sent me a go bag, right, that he wants me to have, which is probably a really good idea. I live in a really tiny New York City apartment, and it happens to be about 10 blocks away in a storage unit. So I pretty much should probably bring that bag. That
No,
probably
you
be
should
helpful
have. I mean,
to have that.
I have a go bag at my house, in my car, and you should
Yeah.
have one in your office too if you're going into the office. You just
Yeah,
don't
that's not
know
a
where
bad
this.
idea.
And it doesn't have to be large,
No,
but
it's one backpack, it has a hand crank radio,
yes,
a
yes,
poncho, first aid,
and
flashlight. Yeah, I should probably go get it.
we all think that disaster won't happen to us, but the
It
odds
will.
are increasing that each of us will
Yeah.
suffer through some extreme weather event as we see temperatures rise, and that just fuels these events.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Any last comments before we wrap up?
Well, I'd just say that all of us can play a role here. It can be distressing to be thinking about, oh my gosh, what could go wrong? But I find it very empowering, and actually can make me excited to think, okay, how can I make a difference by being informed, making sure that my family's safe, and better understanding what's ahead and participating. A lot of people come to me and they seem to express, oh, it's getting so bad. And for me, being involved certainly makes it easier to deal with the fact that, yes, things are becoming challenging. But because I'm involved, I feel purposeful about it, and it brings me comfort to know that there are things I can do today to have a better future.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's a great reminder. Everyone should be involved in their community. It starts with us. So, Alice, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's been very informative on multiple different levels.
Thank you. What a pleasure, Emily. I just have really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. And so I'm your host, Emily Gress. We'll be back with another episode of Bureaucracy.